Hello, BookTube and YouTube. I'm here today to talk about The Diviners by Margaret Laurence. This book is almost non-existent on BookTube, which I find to be a travesty considering I believe it is probably my top read of 2018. Margaret Laurence was a Canadian writer. She died in the late 80s. This book was published in 1974. It is considered her masterpiece, and I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I have read one other of her novels called The Jest of God. She wrote 7 novels altogether, and this one was very controversial when it came out in 1974. It was actually banned by people, and the critics shot it down because of a lot of the subject matter of it, which I will get into now. So this book is set in Manawaka, Manitoba, which is a fictional town. Manitoba, if you're not familiar with Canadian geography, is one of the more central provinces in Canada. It has Ontario on the east and Saskatchewan on the west. And the story follows Morag Gunn, who is, it starts her in the 1930s when she's growing up. She's orphaned at a young age and is raised by friends of the family. You follow her story interspersed with the stories of her ancestors as told to her by the man who's raising her. So you get his perspective on them coming to Canada and how they settled here. You flash back essentially from her in present day as a middle-aged woman who's going through a bit of a crisis because her child is grown up and is leaving home, and so she's redefining her identity. She's looking back on her life, and you follow along. You follow her as she comes of age post-World War II. And so you get this perspective of also the 1950s, where women were very much, getting married, having children, and not really aspiring to careers. But Morag does aspire to a career. She wants to be a writer. And so if you love books about writers, if you love books about books, definitely check this one out. There's a lot of references to the novels that she's writing as she's writing them. There are also a lot of references to stories within stories, and that the storyteller is the perspective that you hear, and is that true or not, and can you even know if it's true or not, and should it even matter if it's true or not. There is also a lot of contradictions in this novel, which I love because I love complex characters, and Morag's perspective as she grows up is very fascinating to me. The way Margaret Laurence used her language to show her immaturity moving into her maturity was very fascinating. She also showed her love of the people who raised her, and also her disdain and disgust for those people at the same time. And I thought that was really, really brilliant, because most people experience that with people we love. We love them. We also get very annoyed with them. We are proud of them, but we're also ashamed of them. There's these feelings that go through you as a human being, and they're not often articulated. You just kind of hide them and think, oh, I'm a terrible person for thinking that about this person that I love. But sometimes you do think those things, and they're very private thoughts. And so you really have the insight into Morag's very private thoughts in this book. One of the reviews that I read said that this book was feminist, period. And it definitely is, especially if you look at the time period of Canadian culture in 1974. The second wave of feminism is going through, and this book is about a woman who's very self-possessed. She's not defined by men. She is very strong in her own convictions, and not always. She can also be quite vulnerable and scared and all those other things that people are, but she is very self-possessed. She is not defined by the men around her. In the few times that she is defined by those men, she moves through those feelings and comes out the other side. And I think that shows a really brilliant type of character that you can root for, and that you can believe in, and that you want to succeed when you see things like that in novels. So Morag is an artist. She's a writer. and she's a mother, a single mother to boot. And so I think that was another thing about this book that was very controversial in 1974. And that is that, women were supposed to be married. They were supposed to be raising their children full time and being at home. And Morag Gunn, she does it her own way. And it shows the struggles of that. It shows the struggles of being both an artist and a mother, and how that is such a balancing act, and often you can't balance it at all. There's a brilliant scene in the book where Morag is at her day job, which she works in the morning so that she can write in the afternoon before her daughter comes home from school. And she gets a call from the school that her daughter is sick, and she goes and picks up her daughter and she brings her home to take care of her. Now, this is, a very typical thing for most mothers and parents to deal with, but she has a novel in her head that is ready to be written down. She's been thinking about it for months. She's been waiting just to get it all formulated so that she can write it down and get going and get deep into there. You want a concentrated amount of time as an artist to sit down and actually belt something out, and she can't do that. She has to take care of her daughter, and so you hear her frustration, you hear her lament that she's like stuck in this limbo where she can't really get this out. And so you understand that it takes her much longer to produce her work than it probably would if she didn't have a child, but that she loves her daughter, she wanted her daughter, and she has made those sacrifices willingly to some degree. But even though when you make them willingly, they're also still often hard. I loved that. I don't think there's been a book that I've read or a movie that I've seen that has depicted the contradictions in that relationship of being an artist and a parent better than this book has. It's just brilliantly done. Also, the love relationships in this book, they're very complicated, but Morag at heart is very self-possessed, and she never tries to own the men in her life. And when she does, she always stops herself and moves on. So I loved that part as well, because very unconventional relationships represented for the time, for 1974. I believe they were unconventional relationships represented, and that gives this novel a very current feeling to me. The only way I knew that it was set in the late 70s, that it was set in the 1930s up until, I would say, it was, the late 60s that they were talking about here, was by the descriptions of the real estate in Vancouver, where I live, which is completely different now. The lack of technology talked about. That's it. I mean, really, the emotions and feelings were so current in so many ways, and amazingly done, amazingly rendered. There's a lot of rawness to this book, a lot of sex in this book. Oh, I wouldn't say a lot, actually. There is sex in this book, and the sex is very primally and basically done. There's not a lot of erotic undertones, and there's not a romantic undertones to it. She writes about sex in a very matter-of-fact way, like describing these characters as complete round human beings who like to eat food, and they also like to have sex, and there's not some sort of a moral value system placed on that, which I thought was really great. And then there's also a lot of raw language, because you're talking about different types of people, different classes of people, and they're going to talk differently in different types of dialects. There's also a really great amount of representation of First Nations in this book. Now, I will say, Margaret Laurence did not have any First Nations ancestry, and so she's writing from very much a white Presbyterian Scottish settler perspective, from Morag's perspective. But Morag is very intimately connected with a Métis man named Jules Tonnerre. His nickname was Skinner, and they met in school, and they grow up together essentially, and they go on to have an on and off relationship for many years. And so you see his perspective, his family's history, his mistreatment and the racism that is perpetrated onto him and his family in the town because they are Métis. Métis means of mixed race, and so you're talking about French colonialist and First Nations peoples. And so the history of Jules' family and his settlement in the area and their struggles, the Métis struggles against the colonial powers, years before in the history of Manitoba, is all represented here, and I think very well represented for 1974 and a white woman writing about First Nations issues. And so Own Voices, certainly the perspectives that we want to hear now, but I feel like she also represented being a mixed race child, and so being a mother who is of one race, and then your child being a mixed race child, and then trying to help them navigate a world when you can't possibly really understand what they're going through when they face racism. So just really beautifully rendered. This is a stunning novel. I will be going on to read more of her novels. I already have The Stone Angel here. And like I said, I read A Jest of God many years ago. I don't think I'll reread A Jest of God. It was also a bit shorter, like The Stone Angel. I think I will just go on to read the rest of her novels. I might reread The Diviners at some point in the future, just because it is exceptional, and I could probably get more out of it in a few years with a future read. This is actually a library copy, but I do plan to order a copy to keep on my bookshelves for myself. And the other book I have about Margaret Laurence is The Life of Margaret Laurence by James King, and I did read this years ago after I read A Jest of God. I don't really remember it though. So this was Maclean's favorite book of one of their favorite books of 1997. So it was published quite a long time ago, I would like to delve back into her life. I don't remember much about reading this book. I think at the time when I read it, I was probably a bit too young to really fully comprehend the maturity of her writing and of her life. So I would definitely recommend this. I think more people on BookTube have to read this book. It's kind of blowing my mind that Margaret Laurence is not more of a name that people bring up when they're talking about Canadian literature. I think part of the reason for that is that Margaret Atwood is so famous, and she is so prolific and still writing, and so she's just eclipsed perhaps some of the other Canadian literature female writers. I believe Margaret Atwood was quite inspired by Margaret Laurence's style. That's just me putting on my own spin here, but having read Margaret Atwood's first novel, I really feel like she was picking up what Margaret Laurence was putting down. She certainly moved in a totally different direction in her future novels, so I think that that's probably where the crossover ended. You could say she looked into covering more of the human relationship in her first 5-ish novels, and then really took off in another direction after that. So I know there is an edition of this book that has an afterword written by Margaret Atwood, which I kind of would like to read because I would love to get her perspective on Margaret Laurence. But I would say please give Margaret Laurence a try and read this book. I mean, if you want to start with her other ones, she has 7 other ones, so I can also recommend A Jest of God. I do remember enjoying that one. But The Diviners is a masterpiece, so it is worth reading. My favorite book of 2018 so far. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope to be back soon. If you have read this book and are also amazed that it's not talked about more on YouTube, please leave a comment below, or any comment you may have. I'm happy to chat to you about it, and I will be back soon with another video.